You're listening to the Bold Apologia podcast. Here you can expect to find real conversation and dialogue centralized around the purpose for sharing the hope of Jesus Christ in light of theology, apologetics, and culture. We hope and believe this episode will add confidence to your faith by equipping you with boldness to share the good news of the gospel. And now, your host, Adam Parker.
Hello there, Bold Apologia podcast listeners. I'm Adam, your host, and as always, I really try hard to get some good guests on the podcast and talk about topics that are important, that really need to be looked into. And one of those things is the topic of miracles. And so I have a great guest on. He's been on before. His name is Matthew McGuire, perhaps one of my most popular podcasts that I've ever done. He participated in, and it was a debate over the supernatural. So if you are new to this, specifically the paranormal, and this debate was over the question, are some ghosts the spirits of human beings? And so Matthew did a great job in the debate. We actually did a poll, and he happened to come out on top, according to those who at least answered as the winner. But it was just a really good debate. I really enjoyed it. He did a great job, and he is just so qualified to be talking about something like this. He wrote a book called A Magical World, and in this book he actually does take a look at something that we're going to talk about, and that's the argument that David Hume makes about miracles. And so before we go any further than that, I really would like to just open it up a little bit for Matt to introduce himself once again to everybody, and even to briefly talk about his book, which we'll go into further depth on later in the podcast. But Matt, it's great to have you on the podcast.
Hey, Adam. Thanks again for having me on. It's a really good environment. So my name is Matthew McGuire. Earlier this year, I published a book called A Magical World. You can read more about it at amagicalworld.info or at my website, mattmcguire.net. But in essence, the book is kind of a one-stop shop for a supernatural Christian worldview. And we've seen more and more books like this come out, especially in the post-Michael Heiser days. My book is a very wide-ranging book because it not only does it address questions like how do you reconcile miracles with the laws of nature, a very fundamental question. It also talks about the supernatural charismatic gifts. It also talks about parapsychology and the implications for spirituality. It talks about near-death experiences, exorcism. So it's a very wide-ranging book. No matter who you are, you're going to leave this book with your mind expanded and with a new appreciation for the cosmos that God has designed. My training is in biblical studies. I got my undergraduate degree from Crandall University in New Brunswick. I also have some training at a seminary here in Maine, and I have just been interested in the topics of supernatural and miracles for at least the last 10 years. I really enjoyed the process of writing this book. And in this chapter in particular was, I thought it was a really important cornerstone for all the rest of the topics in the book, which deals with miracles. Mm-hmm. I treat the arguments from other spiritualities and other religions, but before I go on to do that in the book, I address the fundamental questions from materialists, people that think there's nothing more in this universe than just atoms bouncing around. So you think of people like Bertrand Russell, Carl Sagan, Daniel Dennett, Richard Dawkins, and many of them find their archetype in a guy named David Hume that Adam alluded to earlier. So we'll be talking about his argument against the supernatural today.
Yeah, thank you so much for that brief introduction and overview of your book, and a great segue into the topic we're going to be jumping into. And I got to say, miracles in Christian apologetics are so important, because if there are no miracles, there is no resurrection. In fact, if there are no miracles, there is no creation of the universe by God in the first place. And so these things are important. They have a lot to do with what we believe. And as you had said, just kind of reflecting on your book, you have some stuff in there about the supernatural gifts. I know both of us are charismatic followers of Christ. We believe that the gifts are for today. And one thing that, I was talking about with you just a little before we started the podcast here is that, you know, in Christian circles, it's kind of like the continuationists versus the cessationists when it comes to the gifts of the Spirit. We know that cessationists believe in miracles because they have to. They have to, otherwise they're not Christians. To be a Christian, you must believe in miracles, namely, especially the miracle of the resurrection. And so basically, what we've got here is those who believe in miracles and what I would call a naturalist absolutist, which is someone who rigidly adheres to the belief that only natural laws govern the universe and they leave no room for the miraculous whatsoever. And so, just something to say, because there's a lot of charismatic brothers in Christ who say that cessationists don't believe in miracles. They do. They actually have to believe in miracles. They just don't believe that the gifts are for today. And maybe sometime in our discussion, we'll have an opportunity to shoot some ideas out about that. But going to the topic at hand, I want to explore the concept of miracles. And so I have a question for you here. And I'm just curious, how would you define a miracle? And are there misconceptions that you often encounter when this particular thing is brought up, or that misconceptions even that you just have taken note of in this particular discussion?
Yeah, that's a good question, Adam. So biblically speaking, the terms that you'll often see in the Bible is signs and wonders. Jesus, he did 7 signs, and the connotation is typically something that causes you to wonder. It causes a sense of awe, and usually it's something that in modern terms we would call supernatural. You don't find a really stark division between natural and supernatural in the Bible. It's just the idea, okay, God is doing this special event. That's kind of what a miracle is. So when Moses parts the Red Sea, or the Moses splits the rock and it turns to water, or Jesus walks on the water, it's the God is doing something special here. Now, as we get to, more, I would say, Renaissance, Enlightenment era, we like to really define things really specifically. And I think, um, to the best of my knowledge, there's a really big emphasis on dualism and the separation of matter and spirit, or of matter and mind, when you get to Rene Descartes, where he really radically splits those two worlds. And so people use terms like natural versus supernatural. And in the supernatural category, they'll put anything that God does, or maybe angels or demons or anything like that. So a miracle in modern parlance is just something that doesn't fit our known laws of physics. Now, you could ask 10 different theologians, they'll give you 10 different nuanced answers. Some of them will say, oh, well, God does miracles, but angels and demons do preternatural things. And then humans with psychic powers do paranormal things. And then, they'll try to like divide it into all these little segments, which is fine. But for my purposes, I'm just talking about a miracle as something that happens outside our known understanding of the laws of nature.
Awesome. Thank you so much for making that clear. And so something that I am kind of curious about here is you've done a lot of research, and I'm sure that you've had to read up on so many different things, and you've looked into so many different miracles, different kinds of miracles. I know just from what I know about you and our encounters and our conversations and even your book, you put a lot of research into what you do. And so miracles is one of those things that you've put a lot of research in. And so what are some examples of miracles that have stood out to you in your own research? And why do they resonate with you? And how are they, in particular, how do they relate to what we're about to talk about here? What's the tie-in, and what makes them significant for this discussion?
Yeah, so you will see, since I am using the term miracles, and I really use the term supernatural even more in the book, I put a lot of things under that heading. One of them is the gift of prophecy, where people are given through the Holy Spirit supernatural knowledge that they couldn't have known otherwise, where people
Mm-hmm.
will walk into a church meeting and someone will be just gifted with insight into their life
Yeah.
that couldn't have been known otherwise. I also talk about miraculous healings. This is, of course, the bread and butter of the Pentecostal charismatic movement. But like you said, I mean, cessationists believe in miracles as much as we do. And you can listen to testimonies from a Paul Washer, or I believe even a Justin Peters. He'll
Hmm.
have some stories of miraculous healings.
Right.
I don't pick on cessationists because I think actually there's a lot of amazing, miraculous stories that come out of cessationist camps. And
Right. There is.
what people that read my book will find out is that sometimes it's a terminological difference that we have
Yeah.
more so than a practical difference. So yeah, healing miracles, miracles of prophecy, near-death experiences are covered in my book as sort of a supernatural thing. But then you have to interpret that supernatural experience, of course.
Right.
But all of these things that I described above, they're not accounted for in Newtonian physics. They're not accounted for in even our current understanding of relativity and quantum physics. People have their theories and everything, but as far as the mainstream paradigms, we don't have a very clear hypothesis of what's going on that doesn't involve the word supernatural.
Right. And one of the things that David Hume argues, and I don't know if he uses the word supernatural. In fact, I'm trying to think if I remember back to when I read this particular chapter on, the foundation for the supernatural. Doesn't David Hume make a distinction, or is it you that makes the distinction in the book? Because I know his argument is, essentially a miracle is a violation of the laws of nature, and then he bases everything from that. But was it you that added in there that let's rather than saying miracles, let's say supernatural? I know you kind of alluded to that in what you were saying, but I'm trying to think back to what you were saying in the book in particular because I found it to be profound.
So the question is, did David Hume make a distinction between miracles and the supernatural, or did I do that?
Yeah, or did you clarify that in your book? I'm trying to remember.
So I just point out that my use of the term supernatural encompasses what we call miracles. It also
Okay.
encompasses what we would call paranormal. I use it as a catch-all term, and I don't dispute other really specific categories, but just as a helpful thing to speak in the context of David Hume's objection, because David Hume uses the word miracles and he says they're violations of the law of nature, and I
Yes.
just use supernatural interchangeably with that.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you for clarifying that for me. And so, yeah, Hume famously argued that a miracle is a violation of the laws of nature. And essentially, his argument is since it's a violation of the laws of nature, it's just better to believe people who claim that a miracle happened are either lying or they're mistaken, which is quite the charge when you consider all of the evidence for the resurrection and everything that goes into that to make that claim about them. But I'm thinking in particular of the apostles who went on to die these horrifying deaths for something that they may have been mistaken on. So just a thought there. But could you break this argument down for the listeners even more? Go into more detail on what Hume is saying here.
So first of all, I just want to give some credit where credit is due. Number one, I benefited greatly from Craig Keener's chapters on David Hume in his two-volume Miracles. He
Hmm.
does a fantastic job, and that provided a lot of the fodder for this chapter.
Okay.
And I was also greatly benefited by one of my philosophy professors, Bill Johnson, not the Reading Bill Johnson. He's the other Bill Johnson.
Okay.
Um, and he's really solid and he really helped me grasp these concepts. So David Hume was an empiricist, which in layman's terms just means someone that thinks all of our knowledge comes not from a priori rational statements, but it actually comes from sensory experience that we later make sense of.
Right.
So his empirical argument against miracles was, well, universal human testimony is that miracles don't happen. Therefore, because of this universal testimony, we can dismiss those anecdotal stories of miracles because there must be some other explanation. So it's kind of a circular argument where he throws out evidence that doesn't fit his paradigm. Now, can you return me back to the question that led into this.
Yeah, just that he famously argued that miracles are the violation
Mm,
of the laws of nature,
yes.
and yeah, just breaking it down for the listeners and just laying sort of a groundwork of what his argument
Right.
is.
Right. So Hume said miracles cannot be real. They cannot be true because they violate the laws of nature. So I point out in the book, and this is something that I first saw in Craig Keener's book, that he was confronted with a very powerful healing miracle of Blaise Pascal's niece,
Mm,
Marguerite Perrier, who had I think it was like a miracle of her eye being miraculously restored, and there was like a real organic thing that was miraculously restored.
yeah. Are you
They were
saying
part of
this is Hume that was confronted with that?
he was confronted with this story
Okay,
and
with the story. Yeah.
with the story.
Hmm.
And Blaise Pascal is a huge, well-respected figure. He and his family were somewhat associated with the Jansenist movement, which was like a renewal movement within the Catholic Church.
Hmm.
I think that's the best way to describe it. But there was
Okay.
a lot of miracles going on, and that was one of the well-attested ones.
Hmm.
And David Hume said, "Well, there must be some other explanation." He had a argument that by definition it couldn't happen. So you'll often see with skeptics, they just keep raising the bar. If you present them with evidence that something, that defies our understanding of the laws of physics, they'll simply dismiss it. Um, but you can't operate that way. The whole idea of a law of nature as a ironclad fixed thing is sort of a misunderstanding. And Craig Keener, again, he points this out in his book. That is it's kind of an old hat way of understanding laws. Laws are what we have observed over time, and so we put the name law on it. So I
Hmm.
would say it is a law of nature, in some people's eyes, that it's really bright at noontime. And so
Right.
every day at noontime, it's bright. But what happens when there's an eclipse? Have the laws of nature been violated? Well, clearly there was no eclipse on this date because the laws of nature say it's bright at noontime. Well, this is the same sort of thing. If you have an anomaly, what you must do is not dismiss it, but you have to record it. And if you start seeing more and more anomalies, perhaps you have to expand your scientific paradigm. This is
Right.
where it gets fuzzy because how do you incorporate miracles into a scientific paradigm?
That's that's an interesting thing to bring up, and I'm sure that's why Hume is so quick to dismiss it
Yes,
because he has to.
exactly. So he has to dismiss it. Now, the thing that gets hairy here is if indeed miracles happen through the intelligent actions of beings like angels, demons, or psychic powers, or God himself, that is not easily repeatable in a laboratory.
Right.
That's the problem. You can't, like, if someone gets healed through God's action. I heard about this story of a guy, he was an amputee, and he went 2 years as a beggar, and he had to register with the Spanish town annually to prove that he was a real amputee so that they
Yeah.
would let him beg. They had very
Right.
strict rules. But after 2 years, he has this miraculous dream, and he wakes up, and his leg is back on his body, and it had you have to understand this leg had its own burial service and it was buried. And when they went to go dig it up, the coffin was empty. So
Oh
how do
wow.
you how do you incorporate this into a scientific paradigm? You can't, there's no repeatable experiment you can do on this teleportation leg healing miracle.
Yeah.
You just have to have a some sort of worldview that allows supernatural to have a place.
That's amazing. And just to throw in just another interesting miracle that I know of that happened. I know a man who was a missionary in China, and he was visiting a hospital to pray and meet with the sick. And he watched as this man who was getting treatment, he had some sort of issue with his foot, and he watched as the nurse scrubbed his foot, and all of his toes came off, right? And so bandaged him up and all of that. And this man, he goes and he just believes the Lord saying, you need to go pray for him. He's like, okay. So he goes and he prays for this, what he now realized was a leper. He prays for this leper. He had leprosy, and it was kind of a weak prayer. He just did it to get out of the way. He's like, I got to do this to be obedient to the Lord. And over the course of several months, like he leaves, he comes back. And over the course of several months, something incredible took place. And what looked or appeared to be buds, just 5 buds at the end of his foot, like some sort of blooming thing is taking place. And at the very end of his foot, where his toes should be, started to appear. And over the course of many more months, things continued to progress, and this man had been completely restored. All of his toes completely grew
Wow.
back. And the people of the village of that time, they said to him, "We know that the reason why God didn't just give him his toes right away is because if he did, we would have said he always had his toes." But because they were able to watch this miracle take place over the course of many months, they actually called it the blooming miracle. And so everyone believed, and so this man actually, he ended up becoming a missionary to another part of China, because China is such a big area, and things like that. So it's an incredible testimony, and I think that little sense of human nature is there. Is if God did do it miraculously, in the sense of doing it right away. We just say you'd always have you always had your toes. You were mistaken, and I find myself wondering, what is the spiritual side of this in humanity that wants to relegate nature to his lived experience? And in your book, I love how in your book you argue that the supernatural is much more natural than you would want
Mhm.
to believe. And just to clarify this before we move on and continue to talk about Hume's argument here, but what are some of the main problems you see with his stance on miracles?
Yeah, so we already talked about how
Yeah.
from the empirical side, he has his whole argument is an argument by definition, where he throws out evidence that doesn't fit his statement that universal human experience tells us miracles are false, because there are human experiences that
Yeah.
testify to miracles.
Hmm.
But ultimately, he has this view of the laws of nature, which is very fixed and ironclad. When in good science, you're always revising hypotheses. You're always trying to find the next paradigm. Newton's physics overthrew Ptolemy's, or Newton's astronomy overthrew Ptolemy's astronomy, and Newton's physics overthrew Aristotle's physics.
Hmm.
Not that Aristotle's physics didn't work most of the time, but then Newton had a more complete picture of things. And then Newton's physics was overthrown by Einstein. So there's always a further paradigm. When it gets to the supernatural and the spiritual, it gets a little tricky.
Mm.
This is how C.S. Lewis was able to capture this, and I think it does a good job of showing that sometimes it's unhelpful to draw a very strict line between the spiritual and the material, because think about it. Angels, yeah, they're in the unseen realm, but sometimes they materialized and had physical form, and you
Mm.
see much of this interaction between what we call the spiritual world and the material world in the Bible, and a very hard, strict dualism um, sometimes doesn't do justice. So C.S. Lewis draws this analogy. He says, picture a fish tank with fish in it. In that closed system, if you will, everything that the fish does, all of its reactions, all the ripples in the water can be explained by things in that tank. So that, let's say that's David Hume's idea of the laws of nature. Everything within the fish tank. If something happens in there that can't be explained by the fish in there, or the objects in that fish tank, or the water filter, whatever it is,
Mm.
then we should just dismiss it. It must be a reporting artifact, something we just misunderstood, whatever this anecdote is.
Mm.
Now you zoom out. You find out that this fish tank is in a laboratory and the fish are being studied. And so there's scientists walking around. There's other things going on. Zoom out further and you realize we're in his example. He lived close to World War II. He
Yeah.
says, picture there's bombs being dropped outside in the city, and those bombs from way outside of that closed system are causing vibrations. Those
Mm.
vibrations not only affect the lab, but they affect the water in that fish tank.
Mm.
So we can see the fish tank in itself is sort of a closed system. Think of our natural
Mhm.
laws as we know them. But once in a while, some effect from outside of that system, which is connected to it, but
Mhm.
it's not like 100% of the time it's doing stuff. It's just an intelligent being has decided to drop a bomb in London, and therefore this vibration is going to happen. So once in a while, there is a thinning of the veil between the world of angels and demons and God and our world as it normally functions. And what we fail to realize is that these different layers of the world, if you will, they've always been connected. It's just that it's only when there is an action from an intelligent being that we actually see that action take place. So you can actually have a worldview that incorporates supernatural things, even if we can't predict always when they're going to happen. That's
Right.
the hard pill to swallow, because in science we want to be able to predict everything. And the materialists' theory, if materialists are 100% right, then they always say you could actually have a machine, if it had enough information, it could actually predict the future with 100% accuracy. I don't know if you've ever
Hmm.
heard this before, Adam.
I have not.
But basically, they think, well, if every single thing that happens in the world is just the result of the causes of atoms and chemical reactions, then everything is determinate. There's no such thing as free will. That's what Daniel Dennett says.
Hmm.
Everything is all planned out in advance, because it can all be explained by non-conscious molecules crashing against each other. However, once you throw in these other realms of spirits and of God, then you can have intelligent creatures or intelligences acting upon what we call our natural world. And of course, I do believe in human free will. And many people do, even people that aren't believers in traditional religion, will argue for free will on the basis of certain curious features in physics, um, like the uncertainty principle and quantum physics and things like that, where I'm getting a little bit over my head in talking about this, but the gist of it is that not everything is 100% determinate
Right.
in quantum physics.
Yeah.
So what you have to do when you encounter supernatural phenomena is not just wipe them away as there's no way this can be true. What you have to do is expand your worldview that allows for another layer on top of our universe.
Right. Even with the example I gave of the man who had the budding toes, uh, like they said, had God just given you a new foot right away, we would have never believed you. And so, how does Hume's argument reflect the general skepticism toward miracles we see today? Where do you see his argument at play in some of the skepticism we run into?
Yeah, like I said, Hume is definitely the ancestor, if you will, of a lot
Hmm.
of modern skepticism today. And people point to his work. He's like the hero of the skeptics. And one wonders, what was going on in Hume's own heart? Like, did he have like a resistance to the idea of God? I'm I don't want to say anything that I don't have a perfect memory of, but I have this memory of learning about Hume and how he did have a certain wistfulness that he kind of wished he could believe, but he couldn't bring himself to.
Hmm.
I'll have to get back to you on his his final days and his thoughts and things like that. But I think he did. He thought he was arguing in good faith, and so do most skeptics today. They just can't wrap their head around the idea of miracles and the supernatural. And there definitely has been just a skeptical atmosphere that prevents people from really analyzing data. And this was really prominent in the 2000, post 9/11, basically post nine
Hmm.
eleven till maybe 2009 was the heyday of the new atheists and all
Yes.
that. It really does seem to be shifting though.
Yeah.
Um, and really, atheism is not the number one opponent to the faith these days. It's
It's
really
not.
other spiritualities.
Yeah.
But there still are people that are hanging on to the vestiges of this kind of a worldview. And
By the way, I agree with you. The
mhm,
atheism that we saw from Richard Dawkins in the early 2000s is quite literally, I would say, dead. It is dead.
mm,
Christopher Hitchens' atheism is dead. They've got some followers, but yes, and honestly, that's why we did that debate on the paranormal. Why I had you and Daniel McAdams talk about that is that there's a new front, a new war to fight and it is with the
Right.
new ageism that we see today. And so, yeah, I just wanted to jump in and say that new atheism is now the old atheism, and we're entering into something new. And I don't know what that looks like, but it's kind of interesting to see Satan's wiles fall, I guess, if I could put it that way. So, but anyway, what continue with what you were saying there. I think it was an important
Yeah,
point.
and just to expand on what you were saying, if listeners are interested, two important books on this topic have just been released this year. Justin Brierley, he's the host of Unbelievable,
Hmm.
or he was for many years. He just released a book called The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, and it talks about the whole chronicle of the new atheism and how it fell, and how many people are now returning to spirituality. And yeah, he does talk about some, you know, foraying into occults, but he also talks about a lot of people are just returning to Christianity.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's a more um practicing like a mystical Christianity, like a lot of people converting to Eastern Orthodoxy. But it's there's a big refreshing change of tide in that sense of people,
Hmm.
the pendulum has swung in the other direction. And then on another book that just came out is Rod Dreher's book Living in Wonder,
Okay.
and it's a fantastic exposition of this return to spirituality. He calls it re-enchantment because we've lived in a secular age, as Charles Taylor once called it, and people are coming back to enchantment. And he does
Yeah.
talk about the dark versions of this enchantment, and then he also offers the Christian version of enchant. And he says enchantment
Hmm.
in the sense of not like he says it's not like sprinkling fairy dust on things, that kind of enchantment.
Yeah.
He's talking about the idea that everything in the world has meaning, everything is
Hmm.
transcendent, everything is connected to God. And we're not just blobs of stardust that are just reacting and living
Yeah.
out our chemical purposes. There's
So
a
we're
real
recapturing the wonder of the things we see around us.
recapturing the wonder.
Yeah.
Exactly. So those are two fantastic books that I can recommend to listeners to talk about the demise of the new atheism and this
Hmm.
swing of the pendulum.
Wow, that's great. I'm gonna get those books myself. Question here: how does your book, A Magical World, and I did read this, but just want you to lay it out there. What you say specifically. I know you've touched up on it here and there, but in plain language, in your book, how does it challenge Hume's argument and skepticism similarly? Just lay it out there for us.
Yeah, so I basically addressed both of his arguments. The one about violations of the law of nature, I think I've basically covered. The idea is laws of nature are descriptive, not prescriptive. So it's not
Yeah.
like we've discovered this law of nature written, like we didn't discover the law of gravity written on a tablet. We made measurements and we found, hey, these are the consistencies of gravity. And then Einstein found out there's some additional categories where gravity doesn't function as we expect it to function. And so he revised
Hmm.
the paradigm. So up in at the time of Newton, the laws of nature were descriptive of what we were seeing constantly. And then at Einstein's time, when he revised them, those descriptions were updated. But if you say a law of nature is prescriptive, it's like, oh, the law is
Hmm.
telling us what we have to do. No, laws can never be like that. They can only describe observations. And so when we get observations
Right.
contrary to those paradigms, we just update the description. So his argument falls apart because he sees these laws as prescriptive rather than descriptive. His
Right.
second
Huh.
argument I dismantle just by showing it's not true that universal human experience denies miracles, because you look across the world, especially once you get outside of the West, you
Hmm.
see human testimony to miracles in
Yeah.
every culture and place. This is something you'll see throughout the whole rest of my book. It doesn't matter if you're in Africa, Alaska, Brazil, China, you're going to see testimonies of miracles. And of course, again, Craig Keener just devastates this in his book with the wide volume of testimonies of miracles, not only in the modern
Hmm.
day, but throughout all of history and throughout pretty much every culture. So both sides of his arguments are handled pretty well throughout A Magical World.
Taking his sort of framework here, just that, it's all about the science. And by the way, before I even jump into that, that is so profound so profound. And, just from your book's standpoint, just that he is taking what we've discovered and therefore described, and he's using it as a prescription for his worldview, and how and really in his argument for why we should see the world his way. And so interesting how his argument, even from that standpoint, just falls on its face because he's misapplying, actually misapplying science in that way. That's interesting. That's an interesting nugget there. I love that. Yeah, many argue that miracles, they can't be scientifically proven. They have a problem with that. How would you respond to the claim that miracles as a result of that are actually anti-scientific? They would say that. So what's the deal here? Even though you've given your response, they would say, "Well, yeah, but miracles are still anti-scientific."
Miracles are in, now we can take this in a couple different directions. Like I said, miracles, because they're generally understood as the result of intelligences taking action, they can't be repeated in a lab. But you can still study them scientific. Scientific method includes more than just repeatable experiments. We talk about the science of historiography. You can't repeat the experiment where Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon, but through science just means knowledge. Through the science of historiography, we can make a pretty good argument for that. So you can't prove a miracle in the same way that you can prove the speed of light. You just can't.
Right.
But
Mm-hmm.
you can take the same sort of evidence that we admit into courts of law or historiography, the discipline of historiography, or many other social disciplines, and you can admit them as evidence of the supernatural.
Okay. I actually did a podcast with Dr. Donald Williams. You actually, I don't think you've met him before, but he's a amazing Christian apologist and thinker. And he did a podcast with me, I think it was last year or so. And he talked about the case for the resurrection of Jesus. And he just went through and laid out this amazing case, going through the sources, going through much of the different arguments in support of it. And so here's what I'd like for you to kind of touch up on here is what role do evidence and testimony play in establishing a credible case for miracles, considering they're often not scientifically proven? Will they really, according to Hume, they can't be. And so what's another angle we could go at with that then?
So again, you'll see throughout my book specific examples of miracles, especially in the final chapter on healing miracles of Chris Gunderson and another lady that's healed from blindness that are pretty well documented. And as far as, laying out the case, you want to look for certain things. You want to look for witnesses. We'll go back to the leg reappearing miracle from Spain. It's called the Miracle of Calanda, if anyone is interested. And Jimmy Akin has a episode on it on his program, Mysterious World. And he had witnesses that knew about his leg when he had it. They had witnesses from when he didn't have the leg. And then they had witnesses from when he got it back. And they even confirmed he had the same scars and everything from when he originally had it, showing that not only was it a miracle of the leg coming back, but it was the same leg. You had the witnesses of the magistrates that confirmed that he applied as a beggar on an annual basis. So you have to take human testimony as eyewitness testimony, and if you're prejudiced against the supernatural from the get-go, then you might be inclined to say, well, all those 50 people, all those witnesses, however many there may have been, and those, mind you, those testimonies were taken very quickly after the miracle. It wasn't like 30 years after the fact. It's a very well attested miracle. You also look at something like Saint Joseph of Cupertino. I don't know how you feel about monks. I just wrote something about it, but he was a monk in the boot of Italy, sort of in like the 1600s, and he was known for levitating on a regular basis. Now this, it immediately makes you go, I don't know, man. But he had so many people attested, like hundreds and hundreds of people saw him levitate, multiple witnesses at a time. So you have even more open-minded non-Christian scientists that look at this and say, well, I just can't deny that. Just on a basis of historical evidence, it's overwhelming.
Wow.
So in my opinion, the there really isn't a great uh, argument from the materialists, in my opinion. But what you will find is parapsychologists that they will acknowledge the supposed supernatural event, but they'll try to explain it in a sometimes in a non-theistic worldview.
Right.
I owe a great debt to parapsychologists because they do a lot of great research. There's a lot of great documentation out there from supernatural happenings, and they try to explain it in terms of psychic functioning. But I think sometimes that is an incomplete picture. So I
Mm.
want to read this quote from a Princeton seminary professor, where he talks about, what we should take some of these miracles at face value instead of trying to reduce them all to psychic powers. So this is what he says. If I were to see a glorious being rescue my daughter from an oncoming train, you ever heard these angel stories? I would not posit that I had projected an angelic mirage and in addition somehow managed psychokinetically to lift my child to safety. I would rather infer, using my Christian language, that an angel had saved her. Would this not be the sensible thing to do? So a
Yeah.
parapsychologist might look at a story of an angelic rescue and say, oh, well, that was all like your mental power, like
Hmm.
psychically saving your child from the train tracks and then projecting this image of an angel so it would make sense. It actually seems really elaborate and complex when the more
Hmm.
simple explanation is, oh, God just sent an angel.
Yeah.
So I think parapsychologists have a little bit more credit to them because they'll at least try to reckon with supernatural events and they'll try to come up with an explanation for it.
Hmm.
But I think as Christians, we have another layer. We acknowledge that angels and demons are real things. We acknowledge that God acts in a special way, especially in the context of his church. And I think once you add those layers together, you get a more complete picture.
That's really interesting, and I've never actually thought about that with parapsychologists, and the place that they come from is problematic. It's not a Christian perspective by any means, but at least they're a little closer to getting to the truth than some of these, new slash old atheists the, do when they just, say, oh, well, it was all a figment of your imagination. Oh, you probably just lied. Or, oh, that probably
It's
never
way more
actually happened.
open-minded.
Way more open-minded. So that's definitely something to appreciate. And it is interesting to see the secular world going in that direction where there is more of an openness. And I think that's why it's important to talk about the relevance of miracles today, especially in the Christian faith. And so it's like when it comes to miracles, I believe miracles are central to faith, and it's that case for so many people. And so why do miracles remain so central to faith for so many people? And like people, man, I can't tell you how many stories there are where someone has said, if there is a God out there, please help me with this one thing. I need this miracle, whatever it be, and I will not leave any stones unturned in my pursuit of whoever caused that miracle, and they come to Christ. But why do you think that's just such an important factor there? And this may be a good opportunity for us to even talk about spiritual gifts and hit this from a charismatic perspective here.
Yeah, and this is we have a very or at least my own background is very left brain, if you will, very analytical, so I like abstract thinking, but
Hmm.
there's a whole right brain side of us where we need to feel, we need to have experience, we need to have these intuitive moments where we sense God's presence for our faith to be complete. Faith is not just memorizing a catechism, although that is important. Faith
Hmm.
is also just knowing that God is at work around you, whether this is in the form of providence, these coincidences where God just opens up doors for you that you just know He's at work, or whether it's a more like elaborate miracle, like your leg reappearing.
Yeah.
All of these just excite wonder. That's one of the reasons the Bible uses the word wonder, is because it makes us reconfigure our whole worldview, seeing stuff like this happen. There is, I know you mentioned talking about the gifts, but there is also a flip side of this where people have a fixation on miracles and a
Hmm.
need to experience miracles that can be very
Hmm.
unhealthy.
Yeah, that's
And
true.
I close the first chapter of the book with the story of Archibald in C.S. Lewis's book, The Great Divorce.
Yeah.
Archibald was a parapsychologist. He calls him a psychical researcher, but it's the same thing.
Right.
Archibald, in his lifetime, all he wanted to do was get the scientific evidence that people survive death and the scientific evidence that God exists. And he's all obsessed with this. He's probably referring to the Society for Psychical Research. They did a lot of research with mediums and early versions of what we would call near-death experiences. But he was so obsessed with the scientific quest to prove the afterlife. Then this guy Archibald gets to the afterlife and he has no interest in God. He's like,
Yeah.
oh, well, there's nothing left to prove now. And he had totally missed the forest for the trees. So there's something good about investigating the supernatural and trying to find proof. But if it's just this left brain, I just need to nail this down in my intellect, but you have no heart for wanting to connect with the originator of those miracles, then you've entirely missed the boat. And
Right.
I don't want people to fall into that trap of just
Amen.
miracle chasing
Yeah.
and trying to get a fix on miracles when they should be looking to the gift giver instead of the gift.
Yeah. Thank you for saying that. I was actually just about to say that something that is often shared from the pulpit, especially in charismatic churches, is stop seeking the gifts. Stop seeking just miracles for the sake of seeing them. Seek God first and see what God does after that. Miracles are amazing, they're cool, but there's so many miracles that we can look to and still be in awe of God, even if we don't get to witness miracles right in front of us right off the bat. Like the fact that the universe is even here and it can be reasonably proven, reasonably argued that at one point there was nothing and now there's all this. That's incredible. That is an incredible miracle. It's something that needs to be said. And so, but for so many people, miracles are just part of their lived experience when it comes to faith. And there is the unhealthy side of it, but what is the healthy side of it? Good opportunity here to dig into that. And what are some of the nuggets of wisdom you got to share about that?
Yeah, and I think this is one of the strengths of the potential strengths of the charismatic movement, despite
Hmm.
the excesses and despite sometimes there's a tendency to do miracle chasing. A
Hmm.
healthy version of the charismatic renewal is just an expectancy.
Mm.
We expect, and I think this is really the key difference between cessationists and charismatics, because cessationists believe in miracles just like we do. Charismatics are more inclined to see them as normative. We
Yeah.
live in an expectation that God's going to act, especially if we're in an evangelistic situation. We expect God to deliver from evil oppression. We expect God to make himself known through miraculous healings and to
Hmm.
speak through the gift of the word of knowledge or other forms of prophecy. We have an expectation he's going to do something in
Yeah.
the same way that God showed up in the first several centuries of the church. One of the biggest reasons people converted in the Roman Empire was the one true God performed all these miracles, delivered people from demons that other exorcists couldn't cast out.
Yeah.
We hear it from all the early, many of the early church figures. So, in a healthy sense, it's an expectation that God is going to act, not for personal indulgence, but as a sign of His love and as a sign of the vindication of the name of
Hmm.
Jesus. And just at bottom, just going back to the whole idea of an enchanted cosmos, just knowing that we're more than matter and that human beings are specially made in the image of God. So supernatural things happen.
Yeah. Yeah, and this probably goes more into a theological diatribe that I'm going to jump into here, but I'm just going to do it. Just from the charismatic perspective, miracles and healings and things like that, we see them not as just a thing to seek after to, I guess, just prove God exists or anything like that. Although there's a fair amount of charismatics who do it for that purpose. They do. And, there's that. And then there's also charismatics who don't have a right heart about it and they just want to see miracles happen because of the, and honestly, seeing a miracle happen is pretty stinking cool. And so there's a lot of excitement that comes with that. But just from a theological standpoint, there's a battle going on, and it's between the forces of darkness and the forces of light. Jesus said the kingdom of heaven is at hand. And, when something happens, whether it be a healing, whether it be a deliverance from demons, it's more than just oh, that was cool. God did something, and that's really cool. It's a way we can know He's still here. That isn't necessarily the point of that, and it's not necessarily the point of spiritual gifts either. What it is a way with which we as followers of Christ can combat the kingdom of darkness, which at the end of the Lord of the Rings, right? Aragorn is crowned king. We all know who the king is. We all know who won the battle. But there were still vestiges of darkness out there that he needed to clean off the face of Middle Earth. And when I think of miracles, when I think of healings, and I don't know where you land with healing in the atonement, and it's such a gray area for so many people. But there's cases where healing, I will say there's cases where healing is a case where the kingdom of darkness took a loss, right? Obviously, deliverance from demons. That is a very miraculous thing to take place. To see these dark spiritual beings being expelled from a person. You mentioned in the early church something incredible that happened then was when they did exorcisms, quite different from how we do exorcisms today. And I have a theory for why that is. But exorcisms were very public. And David Miller, you were at his church recently. I'm pretty jealous. I would have loved to be able to do something like that. But David Miller came on and he did a podcast with me on the secret history of exorcism, and he's got a book on it. It's quite an interesting read. And one of the things he talks about and is seen in the historical account of the church is that what these men would do is these exorcists, they would cast demons out of people, demand, okay, what is your name? Which one are you? And if the demon may identify as, well, I'm Pluto or whatever, or I'm Apollo, right? They may say, I'm Apollo. I'm the god Apollo, or I'm Zeus or whatever. And they will demonstrate the power of Jesus over these false gods and expel those demons in public. And we wonder, okay, well, how did the Roman Empire just see this massive revival of Christianity? Well, it was Christians operating in power. And so there is a vast, I don't know how I want to put it, number of ways that you could see the importance of miracles in faith. But when you look at Hume's argument, it seems so weak in the face of, at least from a charismatic perspective, everything that I do see as a lived experience. And I don't know what you want to say to that, or if you have anything to say to that, but what are some of your thoughts there?
Yeah, that was well said. There's something about seeing God's kingdom clash with the other kingdom that really engenders faith. And this goes all the way back to Elijah and the prophets of Baal. It goes back to Moses and the magicians of Pharaoh. And it's something not only in the early church, but something today
Yeah.
that we see.
Amen to that. Here's a question for you just before we really talk more about your book. But what would you say to someone who believes miracles are just wishful thinking? And frame this in such a way that it's more so aimed at someone who doesn't really believe miracles are real. And we know that cessationists believe that. They do. They believe in miracles. But what about someone from a secular perspective?
I'm scratching my head here because I'm trying to think if I know anyone that doesn't believe in any miracles. It's a
Right.
dying breed.
Right.
But I would probably just tell them a few stories. I mean, you can tell them in the abstract, oh, this Gallup poll said 100,000 Americans have seen a miracle. That doesn't really grab people. But you tell
Right.
them two or three really specific stories,
Yeah.
and then you say, well, what would you make of this? And then you pile story after story. And if they're open-minded enough, that should be enough. But
Yeah.
if they're just repeating it like a soundbite, they may not actually be interested in
Mhm.
expanding their worldview.
And if you're listening and you're seeing this in your life, I would caution you against, how do I want to put this? coming from the perspective that you have to prove that miracles are real in order for them to believe God exists. Because I come from the perspective that deep down they actually do know that God exists. And the problem isn't that miracles aren't real. The problem is that they have a warped worldview, and their presuppositions about the world around them are problematic because they've been darkened by the false god of this world, Satan. And so bringing that all full circle, talking about miracles, sharing testimonies, jumping into these things. And, thank you for sharing that, because we should be able to share kind of some stories if we have them. Read Craig Keener's book on miracles, which is actually, like you said, it's actually a really good book. And just dig into some of these things and have something available, because what you're doing with someone, especially if they come from this new atheist perspective, what you're doing is you're coaxing them out of their delusion. Richard Dawkins said that, we're in a delusion, and he wrote a book called The God Delusion. It's actually people from that perspective who are in what Scripture would say their minds are darkened. They suppress the truth in unrighteousness. And when we have stories and when we're able to respond to some of these things like, oh, well, miracles don't exist, what we're doing is we're being a part of the Holy Spirit's process of coaxing them out of their delusion, their darkness that they're in. So anyway, is there anything you'd like to say before we jump into just pushing into promoting your book a little more here?
Well said, Adam. I think you're right. There really is. It's not just giving people two premises and then a conclusion. We're not wired that way as humans. We need to be grabbed by the heart. And so, that a relationship where you can share something that happened in your own life that you really saw God at work, that's really what makes a connection. Not so much, I mean, I don't have any problems with like a presuppositional, in order to use the laws of logic, you have to presuppose the deity, like you have to presuppose that God exists, and then like that may be all intellectually sound,
Yeah.
but your average person on the street is just going to look at you like you got three heads. But if you just
Right.
talk about what God has done in your own life, it may not be something that you can put into a syllogism, but it's something like God has created us to relate to each other on a testimony level, and that's really where you get people to Rod Dreher has this quote in that book I talked about. It's, being enchanted is knowing when to look up at the sky when a comet is passing. So it's just
Yeah.
this openness to seeing God at work. And if you can share how you have come into that kind of a perspective, other people might be more open to it as well.
Yeah, it just makes it digestible, being able to engage them where they're at in that way. And yeah, it's just kind of a powerful way to go about it. And yeah, as believers, those of you who are listening, followers of Christ, you're going to run into these things. You're going to run into conversations about miracles. And, like we've kind of indicated, the new atheism is now becoming old atheism. And we don't know what the status of atheism looks like today, other than that we know that it's dying out. And that's a good thing. But that doesn't mean that you won't run into this particular question or this particular argument, because atheists do exist. And as Christians, it's good to know how to respond to that argument that all atheists have adopted, and it's Hume's argument, just that, miracles are outside of the laws of nature, and therefore they couldn't possibly be. Well, when you dig a little deeper and you consider things, at least in the way that Matthew is bringing them to light, it's easy to see where, they're just mistaken. They're just not right. They're just wrong about that particular issue. And so with that said, I want to take some time to talk a little bit about your book here. I know you shared a little bit already about A Magical World. Is there anything that really excites you about some of the themes of this book that you've written? And actually, I'd love to know what inspired you to write it. First, what excites you about just different aspects of it? Maybe what's your favorite chapter, and then what's kind of inspired you to write it?
Yeah, so I'm just by nature a very curious person. So the greatest impetus for writing the book was just to answer a lot of questions for me, or at least to put into like very solid statements kind of nebulous thoughts I had about theology and things like that. So, chapter one is all about miracles and David Hume's argument. Chapter two is a whole spectrum of what Christians believe, and you find that there's a whole category of Christians that behave just like materialists. Rudolf Bultmann is sort of the archetype for this sort of person, where they're Christians in name, but they dismiss all the miracles in the Bible as just like, you know, they're just psychological, existential um, stories that help us cope with living in this world, but they're
Which is
not
bizarre.
literally miracles. But
Yeah.
Paul explicitly says, if the resurrection didn't happen, our faith is in vain. So you
Hmm.
have that whole category of Christians that have given up on the miraculous. But then you have, and I think cessationists will really appreciate how I address the topic of the gifts, because I affirm many of them and their lifestyles. And there's even some versions of cessationism are so spirit filled that I wouldn't ask you to change anything. Vern Poythress, he's got an amazing article on the gifts of the spirit that is like, I agree with 95% of it, and he is a cessationist.
Hmm.
Doug Wilson has a version of cessationism that allows all these different gifts to be active. He just doesn't see them as um, like the same gifts that were back in the day. It's just God just kind of does these things. And in fact, I got the title A Magical World from Doug Wilson himself, who is a
Wow.
cessationist. He
Wow.
loves using that phrase. We live in a magical world where all sorts of magical things happen all the
Huh.
time.
That's
And
interesting.
so I interact and engage with cessationists. I love where a lot of them are coming from, and I agree with them more than I agree with certain strands of the charismatic branches of the faith. So,
Mm.
yeah, I wanted to explore all the things that I've learned about the gifts of the Spirit, because I grew up in a church where we didn't emphasize that at all. And then I wanted to make sense of just a wide tapestry of supernatural things and see if I could not just try to point them. I've read a lot of books where they just point out, oh, this is amazing. Like, how do you explain this? I wanted to put a worldview approach to it and show how, I can't explain every single aspect of ESP. I can't explain every single aspect of near-death experiences or exorcisms, but when you wrap up all the core elements of these things and you overlay on top of it a biblical worldview, there's a lot of connecting points. And so the
Hmm.
book was a lot of connecting the dots, and I think it's going to be very helpful for pastors in this coming age where there's a lot of spiritual but not religious category out there. They can
Yeah.
answer some of the questions that are coming from people that have supernatural experiences, some
Hmm.
good, some bad, some, neutral, or we don't know what to make of them.
Yeah.
I want people to be equipped to at least have some starting points to engage with the supernatural. And so I did it for myself. I did it for other people, other Christians that struggle with these topics or are curious. And I did it for people that aren't Christians that are just looking for some solid ground to make sense of their experience.
Amazing answer. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I just really appreciate everything that you had to share there. That's some really great thoughts. And real quick, what's your favorite chapter?
I think I had the most fun writing the near-death experience
Interesting.
chapter
Interesting.
7.
And what interests you about that chapter in particular?
What interests me the most is that it is universal.
Hmm.
So you have from all times and all places, going all the way back to Plato, instances of people coming with getting a close brush with death, and then
Hmm.
coming back to consciousness and reporting being out of their body, being in a heavenly realm, and all these different
Hmm.
experiences. And it's just a fascinating thing, even from a scientific perspective, how well attested it is. And in fact, this is one of, like I said, parapsychologists, one of the topics they study is called the survival hypothesis. Does the human consciousness survive death? And in the early days, they focused on mediums and a little bit on out of body experiences. But nowadays, they're just looking at near death experiences because the evidence is overwhelming. There are some people that would dispute that these are supernatural instances, but scientifically speaking, the evidence is very overwhelming. A good book written by a non-Christian on the topic is called After by Dr. Bruce Grayson, that's been studying this for 4 decades. and he just compiles, and it's meant for a lay reader. It's not like a really academic one, but he lays out the scientific evidence that people are surviving death and then they're coming back. And then I try to take the scientific evidence, present it, and then offer some Christian perspective on the experiences that are reported by these people.
That's awesome. So I just want to say, if you're a pastor, you should definitely get this book. And the reason why you should get this book is, as we've already shared, new atheism is dying and it's becoming old atheism. And the new sort of opponent that we as the church need to prepare to clash swords with is this new sort of spiritualism, new ageist kind of movement where they believe in miracles, they maybe even have seen supernatural things. And this is just a really great book all across the board where you can actually be able to be, in this case, prepared to give an answer to these people about what these things actually are. That would be just a really great use for this book. And I really do recommend this for anyone who is just curious about the topic. And what I love is when you and I first ever even started to kind of email back and forth about the potential of this podcast taking place, you kind of framed it as kind of like a charismatic apologetic resource. And you know what? You were dead right. So if you're out there, you come from the charismatic perspective, give this a look. You'll be real excited. It was real exciting for me. So yeah, and just want to ask, where can listeners find your book? And are there any upcoming projects that you'd like to share?
Yeah, so I do have a book website. It's amagicalworld.info. But if you want to see everything that I put out, you can go to mattmcguire.net. I actively post articles on my Substack, and I put all of my podcast interviews on my webpage. So you can find everything right there on my website. The Substack articles are kind of like the DLC of my book. It's extra topics that I wanted to address, but you can only do so much in one book. So if you enjoy A Magical World, the book, you're going to enjoy the articles that I put out on a regular basis. You can subscribe to that for free, and just see all the other stuff right at mattmcguire.net.
Awesome. Just want to say thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Just want to recap a few things here. We took a look at Hume's argument. The reason why we did that is because it's pretty foundational to modern atheism. And, you know, it's that argument that a miracle, being a violation of the laws of nature, is just not possible. And if I can just simply prove that miracles are not possible, then Christianity loses. Well, we found that as time has gone by, new atheism has quickly become old atheism. And at the end of the day, Christianity is still standing. New atheism is falling apart. And now there is this new spiritualism that has made its way into the mainstream. And I'm just so thankful for you, Matt, being one of those who can come up with the answers that we as Christians can give as a response to some of these things. Just love what you had to share about, you know, the issue with Hume's argument being that he's taking something descriptive of what we see, being the laws of nature, and he's misapplying it as a prescriptive thing, and it's just not. And we should all be more open to miracles because, quite frankly, they happen all the time. And the laws of nature does not negate any of that by any means. So anyway, anything you'd like to share just before we go here?
Just thank you again, Adam, and best of luck with your program.
Thank you very much. Everyone, thank you so much for listening. In December, we're probably going to be having Dr. Donald Williams back on the podcast, and I will let you guys know on Bold Apologia Podcast Facebook page and Instagram what that topic will be. But podcasts with Dr. Williams always go very well, and I'm really excited for that. Please take a look at Matthew's book, purchase it, look into it. He's got it on Kindle, Audible. I actually just listened to that recently, and it's a great listen. You know, just get the book, purchase it, support his work, because I really do believe that there's more to come. Really excited about what God is doing in, through, and for you in this season. It's going to be great days ahead for you in all of the things that God is using you for. So thank you very much, Matthew, and thank you to our audience. You guys take care, and goodbye.
Thank you for listening to the Bold Apologia podcast. To find out more about Adam Parker's projects, writings, or guest podcast episodes, visit his website at www.boldapologia.com. There you can get more information regarding Adam's works, contact him to be a guest on your show, or leave him a comment for Q&A. Until next time, thank you and God bless.